Why do Muslim majority countries exhibit high levels of authoritarianism and low levels of socio-economic development in comparison to world averages? Why Muslim societies today are disproportionately much greater part of violent conflict more than all other religions put together? Ahmet Kuru, professor of political science at San Diego State University, California, reject popular Western explanations which point to Islam as the cause of this disparity. Because Muslims were philosophically, socio-economically, scientifically and technologically more advanced than Christian West and the rest of the world between the 8th and 12th centuries. Kuru also argues that Western colonialism was the result of Muslims' decline, not its cause. He explains that Muslims had influential thinkers, philosophers, original jurists, merchants and scientists that led the world of late antiquity with their innovative ideas. Muslims were the leaders. Then what went wrong? How, when and why the decline of Muslim thought and mind set in? Kuru points out that from the 11th century, an alliance between orthodox Islamic scholars, the ulama, and military states began to emerge. This military mullah alliance, as Pakistani scholar Pervez Hoodboy had once defined it, in the context of Pakistan, gradually hindered intellectual and economic creativity by marginalizing intellectual and bourgeois classes in the Muslim world. Professor Kuru's path-breaking work links its historical explanation to contemporary politics by showing that, to this day, ulama state alliance still prevents creativity and competition in Muslim countries. So what's the way forward for Muslims? Dr. Moeed Pirzada, editor Global Village Space magazine, invites Professor Kuru in what he believes will be the first in a series of discussions to grapple Muslim predicament. He also requests you to join this channel, Iconoclasts with Moeed Pirzada, to further an informed discourse on the issues that challenge our times.
In the last 300 years especially, Ottoman society, especially Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, had a very low literacy rate. For 300 years, Ottomans did not get printing technology. And they say, let's not to discuss Muslim problem, just focus on white man supremacy. Say, look, the West is collapsing. It's not time to discuss Muslim problems. We will be superior again. But Western people, many scholars, are very smart. They know how critique helpful for society's future.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Moeed Pirzada in Washington. I am now joined by Professor Ahmet Kuru, who is the Director for Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies and a Professor of Political Science at San Diego State University in California. Professor Kuru has written several books, monograms, and papers. These have also been translated into different languages. But his last book, Islam, Democracy, and Underdevelopment, that has been translated into different languages, continues to attract international attention and debate. And this is the starting point of my discussion. And I will also like to tell you in advance that I believe this is going to be the first of a series of discussion with Professor Kuru on the subject. Professor Kuru, I'm grateful for your time. Thank you so much for finding time out of your classes to discuss with me. A very warm welcome.
Thank you. The honor and pleasure belongs to me, Mr. Moeed Pirzada. I have followed you in the media, social media, and in fact, I gave one of the first interviews about my book in Pakistan to your magazine, Global Village Space.
Professor Kuru, thank you so much. It was very widely read. Thank you so much for it. And it's a pleasure to be with you. So my first question, a very open question to you is that this book, Islam, Democracy, and Underdevelopment, continues to attract the international debate. What made you write this book? What made you research for that book?
So there are both personal and academic motivations for me. Personally, I was born in Turkey. In the last 25 years, I've been in the United States, but during my childhood, similar to almost all other Turks, I was grappled by the question of what went wrong with the Ottoman Empire, why the Turkey at the time was so prestigious and important, but not anymore. And that's why I start the book with an anecdote about my late father and his debate with a secularist general about the contribution of Muslims to human civilization. And in my first book, I compared Turkey with France and US in terms of secularism and the legal structure. And with this 2019 book, Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, I decided to put Turkey into much broader context. Initially, it was Middle East, then became the entire Muslim majority world, which is 50 countries. And the more I examined, the more I realized that, first of all, the general attitude in Western academia about almost denying the fact that Muslims ever had an intellectual decline was very problematic.
Explain to me. I missed the point. The absence of the debate in the intellectual circles, in the Western intellectual circles, that Islam
Definitely, because when I came to the United States, late 1990s, it was a high moment of Edward Said's book Orientalism.
Right.
I had the chance to see him in person before he passed away, great scholar Edward Said. I'm teaching his book Orientalism to my students every year. It's an important contribution saying that the Western academia should put aside its prejudices against Islam, Arabs, and the Oriental people, Eastern people. But everything can be overused. If you eat honey, that's nice, but too much honey may hurt your stomach. So too much emphasis on the book became an apology for Islamists, Orthodox scholars, ulama, cultural conservatives, you name them, to cover up problems in the Muslim world. As I said, I was born in Turkey. I knew the problems in my society. I knew how Ottomans, despite their military grandeur, power, intellectually was a very backward society. Intellectually, I refer to education, literacy rate, book publishing. In the last 300 years, especially, Ottoman society, especially Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, had a very low literacy rate. They have very limited number of book publication. And let me be specific. For 300 years, Ottomans did not get printing technology. From Gutenberg around 1450 to Ibrahim Müteferrika in Istanbul, 1720. About 3 centuries, Ottomans did not get the technology. Can you imagine a society?
What was the reason? They were interacting with Europe. What was the reason?
That's a major question I ask in my book. Can you imagine a society today without internet 300 years? Even Taliban, I guess, would be using internet. So what was the reason? It is all the psychological mechanisms. First, denial. First, Muslims in Turkey and certain Western academics in America said, there is no problem of not getting printing press for 300 years because Muslims in the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere already writing manuscripts manually. They had enough books. But then I look at the numbers of the books in the Ottoman libraries in comparison to the French, English, and other libraries in Europe, and the Ottoman numbers are minuscule. So it is not true that by handwriting they were very efficient. Second, if handwriting is so efficient, why did all Muslims move to printing technology after 18th, 19th, 20th centuries? Why don't we see people writing manually today? Because it is very expensive, very slow, and you make many mistakes when you write. Therefore, everyone, even the most radical Islamists, Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, Iran, they all use technology.
let me interject with the thought. I also had the opportunity of attending a class from Professor Edward Said. I was a postgraduate master's student in SIPA, School of International and Public Affairs, right? And I read his book. And I subsequently, over the years, I thought that the book had provided the defense not only to the Muslim scholars, but also to the left-wing scholars of the Western world in saying that don't criticize cultures because every culture is unique and complete in its own aspects. And I think in countries like Pakistan, where I come from, this argument has become a very big argument that, we have a complete, sophisticated culture, so we shouldn't really be criticizing the culture. So every culture is equal. I mean, is this what you're saying when you said that Orientalism provided a sort of an apology or a defense to the Muslim scholars and even non-Muslim people who were studying Islam that don't criticize, look, I mean, you shouldn't criticize the cultures. Is this what Orientalism did?
So let me close the windows I already opened. So as you said, I wrote the book and I am explaining that both personal and academic reasons, and they became combined when I come to America and see the denial based on Orientalism book and other literature. One dimension of the denial is the Muslim apology. Arab nationalists, Turkish nationalists, some Islamists, they want to deny. In the Western academia, there were three reasons. One, as you referred to, the left-wing, postmodern, post-structuralist criticisms of Michel Foucault and others of Western imperialism that was used to justify the Islamist apology. The second is good Western people who feel guilty because of colonization, racism, and imperialism. And they say, let's not to discuss Muslim problem, just focus on white man supremacy. Then the third thing is that Western people, many scholars, are very smart. They know how critique helpful for society's future. That's why they wrote books like Decline of America, Collapse of Western Civilization. Muslims in Turkey and the Arab world, they didn't understand the point of self-critique. They translate this book into Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and say, look, the West is collapsing. It's not time to discuss Muslim problems. We will be superior again. But my response in this book and overall my debate, saying that, no, we should have self-critique. Do not just translate Western publications without understanding their message. They are trying to make West more powerful by critics. So that's what I'm trying to do, make Muslims more powerful, smarter, well-educated with critique. And the postmodernism, Orientalist debates, they have been used so far by Islamists and others to cover up. And let me conclude historically, it's a fact that in the beginning of the 19th century, literacy rate among Muslims in the Ottoman Empire was less than 5%, probably 2-3%, whereas it was 30% in Western Europe. And one last number. When Ottomans started the printing technology in 18th century, they printed 50,000 books. Although they were late, they were ahead of all other Muslim societies because printing came to Iran, Egypt, Southeast Asia much later. Only 50,000 books in the Ottoman Empire. In the same century, Europe printed 1 billion books.
1 billion books.
1 billion, 20,000 times more, 18th century.
Oh my God. So,
and when I compare this situation with the early Muslims, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12th centuries, how they pick up paper technology from China, how they wrote books, big libraries they founded, and at that time, Europe resisted for 500 years to paper making. Europe was backward from 8th to 12th century. Europe didn't have the paper making technology. So I'm asking, what explained the change of roles? We were ahead of technology, Europe was backward. Then Europeans get the technology, we became backward. What explained this reversal of fortune?
Just a thought to share, the many people in Pakistan, many highly educated people in Pakistan, I have found them saying this thing, that go, Dr. Moeed, read that book about the decline of the West and the collapse of the Western civilization. You will see that such and such professor at Harvard and Columbia and Princeton has himself written this. He himself is saying that American civilization is collapsing. And I think more than 90% of the literate, educated Muslims seriously believe in this thing, that actually the West is collapsing. And they think that it's somehow or the other, because of the higher immigration rate or because of the higher birth rate, it is the time for Islam to actually come forward. I mean, it's so interesting to hear this thing from you. So what were the main challenges, because from the initial chapters of your book, you grappled with the issue that was that colonialism responsible for the decline of Islam? Was Islam itself responsible somehow or the other for the intellectual decline? Was patriarchy responsible for this? Were the Crusader invasions and the Mongol invasions responsible for this thing? Or the consolidation of the state power over the scholars was responsible for that? So what were the other questions? What were the questions? What are the leading questions?
A major challenge was to document Muslim golden age, because when I compare Muslim society today with their early history, when I say there was a golden age, some people are very critical. Some secularists in the Muslim world and certain Westerns deny. They say, no, Muslims never had golden age. It's a fantasy.
Really?
Again, yeah. Therefore, because it's today, for example, you and I can compare Turkey and Pakistan GDP per capita. We have numbers, technology, computer. But it's very difficult to document golden age in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries because, for example, out of thousands of books in Ibn Nedim's Fihrist that documents Muslims' scientific publications, 90% are lost. Only 10% we have extant in some manuscripts and libraries. It's very difficult to hold the historical archive of this golden era. That's why I spent this particular chapter, first of all, to show how dynamic, productive Muslims were between 8th and 12th centuries. It was a response to Western scholars like Ernest Renan in the 19th century, famous French philosopher said, oh, Muslims didn't have a golden age. If they had some productivity, it is just imitation of Greek philosophy. And I document in the book that Muslims learn, yes, from Greek, but also from Persians, China, Africa, India, multiple civilizations. And they read Ptolemy astrophysics, but try to go ahead of him. They read Greek Galen medical science, but they criticized and made contributions. And today, the terms we use like algorithm, algebra, alcohol, they are all coming from Arabic, not a coincidence because of Muslim mathematical contributions, and also the optics, the proto version of camera and others invented by Muslim at the time. So this is one thing, it exists. Then Islamists like Sayyid Qutb, Mawdudi, others says, oh, we were very pious, religious people. That's why we became successful. And then we stopped being good Muslim. That's why we are backward today.
So I think
if we become more religious, we'll have another golden age. That's what they argue.
Two things actually trouble me here. So given between which you refer to, I understand, is between the 8th, maybe the end of 7th, with the 8th and 12th centuries are the golden era of the Islamic civilization. Given the huge contribution they made in physics and chemistry, in architecture, in medicine, in mathematics and algebra and different ways, yet when you arrived in the United States, you actually felt that somehow or the other, 25 years ago, this era between the 8th and 12th centuries was not fully understood. This is one point that troubles me. The second is that I do not know what argument Maulana Maududi and Sayyid Qutb gave for the Muslim rise in physics, chemistry, biology, human sciences, architecture, archaeology, and everything by saying that we progressed because we were pious, because we were modest. What connection did they ever establish between piety and physics and chemistry and biology and architecture? What was the argument?
It's just an ideological rhetoric and a defense mechanism And again, since ordinary people have very limited access to history, making such political claim can live without being falsified. But in the book, I try to document once again that, first of all, yes, Islam was important because Islam brought hygiene, time management, discipline, a sense of community, a sense of civilization. Arabic language became the center of intercontinental trade. And Islam brought the concept of trust. That's why Muslim economists established innovations such as check, that the check we use today, all the old generation, the young people generally use credit card. It's coming from Persian term sheikh in English, French, and others.
Oh,
Because,
really?
yeah, it is Muslim banking innovation. And this civilization at the same time was very open-minded. It wasn't simply religiosity or piety, because Christians contributed, Jews, Hindus, Zoroastrians contribute to Muslim or Islamicate philosophical economic dynamism at the time. We have historians documenting how in Egypt, Jewish and Muslim merchants living in the same neighborhood, collaborating socially and economically. So that's why the Golden Age was real, and also a time of multiplicity, diversity. It's not a time of Islamist orthodoxy. So that's why everyone tried to use Golden Age without understanding what it really is. And for me, this is a good inspiration for Muslims to be open societies, dynamic, multicultural. So therefore, we don't need Western model of democracy and liberalism if we know the early Muslims, how the open-minded they were in their conditions, of course. In the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century, we are not talking about liberal society, but under those circumstances, Muslims were much more tolerant than Europeans.
So what started to bring the decline?
So the decline is a very complex issue. Some people who didn't read my book, just look at the cover and maybe some pages, says, oh, you blame Ghazali. And I thought that I know how Ghazali, very important, almost all societies, especially Turks, maybe also Pakistanis, because we are coming from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, Hanafi background. Ghazali was a genius. He was a product of the Golden Age. That's why we cannot produce such scholars now, since we don't have the legacy of the Golden Age anymore. But one man, even if it is Ghazali, cannot stop a whole civilization. That's what I said. No, my analysis is broader. I look at the 11th century transformation when there was economic crisis because of some climate change, declining agricultural revenue. The Abbasi and other rulers moved from monetary market economy to semi-feudal economy. We call it in Arabic iqta. And this iqta system, based on centralized state, distribute revenues and lands and tax farming. It's a semi-feudal regime, not replacing the old and very successful monetary economy in the Muslim world. And this marginalized Muslim private entrepreneurs and merchants. But the merchants were the backbone of Islamic Golden Age. It was merchants who were sponsoring not only secular philosophers, but also ulama. Abu Hanifa, founder of Hanafi school, was himself a silk merchant. Ahmet bin Hanbal worked in the textile sector. Shafi and Maliki refused to be paid by the government. So the ulama defend their independence because they were funded by commerce. So that was the secret ingredient of the Muslim early achievement, because there was certain separation between the ruling class and the ulama, economics, and the scholarly community. But after the 11th century, when the economic crisis created a new state central mechanism that marginalized merchants, ulama started to be produced in the madrasa system. The Seljuk Empire, Grand Vizier Nizam al-Mulk established Nizamiya madrasas, and these madrasas produced ulama a very different mindset than Abu Hanifa and others. The new ulama got paid by the authorities, and then they became part of government structure.
So you're saying in a way that between the 8th and the 12th or 11th century, the Muslim institutions of learning and scholars were not being financed by the Umayyads or by the Abbasids, but by themselves and by the commercial circles. So it's funny that this week, Donald Trump administration got a shut-up call from Harvard. They threatened them by cutting off $9 billion, and Harvard said, no, the Harvard community has to be independent of the government interference. And within hours, the Trump administration has taken away $2.2 billion from the Harvards. And Harvard could see through that, its independence is more important than the billions of dollars, right? So you're saying that Muslim institutions in the early golden era were also independent of the state patronage. Is this what you're saying?
Thank you. This is an excellent question. It's exactly what I am trying to say, because my argument about social classes and their relations are universal in Europe, in China, in the Muslim world. Whenever a society give autonomy to scholars, religious or others, economic entrepreneurs, and if the government not to abuse and oppress them, then you have justice, efficiency, prosperity. Whenever you combine these together, you end up with corruption. I was in India last month to launch my books in the Hindi version in the Delhi Book Fair. Then, in order to help the audience about the argument, I said, look, in America now, Donald Trump and Elon Musk, politicians and corporations, they are coming together. This is against my argument, because that will create inefficiency and some level of corruption. Then some newspapers made the headline, what is the similarity between ulama state in Islam and the state corporation in America today? So some socialists and communists review my book saying that, why do you appreciate merchants so much? I say, look, I appreciate them, but I don't want a society dominated by merchants. I don't want a society dominated by the ulama. Every class should be autonomous and respect the others. And your question is very well taken. Yeah, this is the problem we are having globally now.
Very, very interesting. So what do you think of a state like Iran dominated by the ulama under the faqih? What is that? The whole principle of Imam Khomeini. What is that?
There is a big debate in social science literature about Islamists. Some, as you refer to, left-wing scholars say, oh, Islamists are modern phenomena. Some are even are postmodern days phenomena. My position is that Islamists have a strong historical deep roots, but at the same time, they are much more ideologically utopian than medieval thinkers. Because look, my argument is that before the 11th century, there was a separation between ulama and state. After the 11th century, what emerged was ulama-state alliance. And in some Pakistani friends says mullah military alliance.
Oh and my God. So mullah military alliance starts from 11th century.
Yes, in the 11th century, gradually in Central Asia, Iran, then moved to Iraq, 12th, 13th century, Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, with the great Saladin, who defeated the Crusaders and then established the Ayyubi, the Mamluks. And the Ottomans established Sunni ulama state alliance. Safavis in Iran established Shia ulama state alliance. And these alliances was medieval, still accept two entities, ulama and state.
But why was it happening? Why from the 11th century and not before? Why from the 11th century the state started to incorporate the ulama, wanted to create an alliance? Why?
So from a normative point of view, both Sunni and Shia ulama from 8th to 11th century had a principal distance from the government. It all started with Siffin War, Jamal War, and Karbala, and the murder of the Prophet ﷺ's grandchildren, especially Hazrat Hussein, by the Umayyad authorities. Abu Hanifa and others they were very critical of Umayyads. And then Abu Hanifa became critical of Abbasids. So the Abbasi Caliph, the Sultan, invited Abu Hanifa to become the judge, maybe the grand jurist, and he refused.
Interesting.
And then the Abbasi Caliph said, you have to give me an explanation. Why are you refusing? And Abu Hanifa says, I'm not qualified. Then Abbasi leader was angry. You are the most qualified. You are a liar. Then Abu Hanifa said, a liar can never be a judge. Then they put him in prison. They poisoned him to death. So
this is how Imam Abu Hanifa died in prison.
Yeah, he was killed in prison because he refused to be serving the Abbasids.
So one of the most respected of the four jurists of Islam was imprisoned even in the 8th century, right?
Yes.
Even in the 8th century, and died in prison.
And just for his principles, he's defending the principle that ulama would never serve the state. And Ahmed bin Hanbal was also sentenced to that. Then a new caliph came with a different mentality, and then he removed the death sentence, sent gifts to Ahmed bin Hanbal. He refused the gifts. When his children accepted the gifts, he was angry against his family members, saying that we should never accept the gift of a sultan. So this principle position, starting from Karbala, the idea that the politicians are corrupt, was not only anecdotes of leading figures, but also we have numerical data. A study show from the 8th to 11th century, out of about 4,000 ulama, only 9% accept to be qadi, like Abu Yusuf, the student of Abu Hanifa, Imam Yusuf, who was very critical. People criticized him at the time. Why did you accept? Why did you do that? Yes, I don't deny that there was 9%, but 91% had private jobs, different occupations, mostly from commerce. When you look at today, Pakistan, Turkey, Iran, and you ask the question about Iran, the ulama completely state. They say, let us say, no, we are the state. And it's very difficult to find privately funded ulama today. They are minority. They were historically majority. So let me conclude saying that despite my critiques of the ulama state alliance and the Ottomans and others, medieval system was still better than Islamist ideology because it says ulama and state separate, but they collaborate and ally. Then came modern idea of Hassan al-Banna, Islam ad-din wa dawla, which basically means Islam is both religion and the state. Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb of Ikhwan Muslimin, Mawdudi of Jamaat Islamiyah, they all propagandate the unity. Although Khomeini was Shia, he was influenced by them, and he produced the idea of Velayat al-Faqih as the founding principle of this semi-theocratic Iranian republic. So everything connected to each other.
So you said Hassan bin Banna, the Egyptian, he basically said that state and the religion are together. But in Urdu, in Persian, scholar and poet, the poet of Pakistan, poet of East, Shair Bashrik Alama Iqbal's very famous verse is,
We all love him, yeah.
Yeah, Juda ho deen siyasat se to reh jati hai changezi. That if you take away the religion from the politics, all what you left is actually the Changeziyat, the Chengiz Khan sort of thing. So you think that Iqbal was merely echoing the ideas of Hassan bin Banna?
No, even so, let me tell you this. That's a very interesting question. When I look at the ulama state alliance and try to understand how they justify it, because there is no Quranic justification or hadith. And then I find out that they use a fabricated hadith, which says, which says religion and state are twin brothers. They are twins. Religion is the foundation, state is the guardian. That without foundation collapses, that without guardian perishes. And then the reality is this maxim was said by King Ardashir of Iranian Sasani empires 300 years before Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. So after the 11th century, when the ulama need a justification, they took this Persian maxim and say this is an hadith. And that's why in many books, Sufis and ulama and recently Islamists keep repeating this again and again. Religion and state are always together. This is an Iranian old government maxim. It has nothing to do with Islam.
How significant in your research and understanding is the debate between the Mu'tazila and the Ashari, and the fact that the rationalists lost to the literalists in the 10th century? How significant is that to the decline of Muslim mind?
So in social science, we have a very big question whether ideas or material factors really shape history. And another related question, whether some leaders or broad structural societal factors. So the Ashari Mu'tazila debate is important. I analyze in the book, but it is just a source of idea. And then I'm asking the question, why were the Mu'tazila ideas defeated, whereas Ashari ideas gained the political debate? That's when I bring the issue of material factors like economy, like the land revenue system, and then the importance of merchants. So therefore, ideas and materials factors, and then major figures like Ghazali, Mawardi, Ibn Taymiyyah, but at the same time, broad social trends. We have to look at all of them. One thing about Mu'tazili, in fact, they were very much diversified. Yes, there are clear 5 principles of Mu'tazili, but other than this, there were multiple Mu'tazili with different ideas. Very heterogeneous.
Saying, what was the gist of the ideas of the Mu'tazila?
They're basically, so here is the origin, if we make it simplified. When Muslims came to Damascus in the 7th and early 8th century, there was no Kalam school, but Christians had established theology schools. Then Muslims came to say to them that you are polytheists, you believe in 3 gods. When Christians says, no, you believe in 2 gods, Allah and the Quran. Then they say, we don't worship Jesus as the God, but Jesus is word of God eternally, and you worship Quran as the word of God eternally. That's the point where Mu'tazili developed the notion that Quran is the creation of God, but not word of God like Jesus. And then they became more rationalists, paying attention to free will and interpreting Quran because it's a creation. It was a reaction to Christians and the debate, because Kalam is basically a debate. That's why we call in English speculative theology. But to make the long story short, Imam Ashari, he was a Mu'tazili. Then at the age, he was a Mu'tazili, and his father-in-law, Jabbar, was a leading Mu'tazili Imam. Until the age of 40, Imam Ashari was a Mu'tazili. At the age of 40, Imam Ashari went to the mosque, according to the anecdote, and he said, listen to me, people. I gave up this ideology. I believe that the Quran is not a creation of God, but word of God eternally. No, that Mu'tazili interpretations. It's take everything literally, not metaphorical.
What's the difference between Quran is not the word of God and is the creation of God? What's the difference?
So it's basically a semantic debate, but Mu'tazili, with the idea of creation of God, put the Quran in a historical context. Whereas Ashari, as when you take it, eternal word of God, you deny interpretation based on context. So these are important debates, but I also want to tell the audience that they have many agreements. For example, even the most radical Ashari, even the people who Hanbalis who reject any interpretation, they accept that there is Asbab-i Nuzul. Asbab-i Nuzul basically means every verse in the Quran, when they are revealed from God, there were a reason for the revelation. They came after an event happened. Nobody denied this. Another thing, so this is a very complex thing, maybe we'll discuss separately, but my idea of separation. Some people say, oh, you are bringing Western idea. It's not Western idea. Look, Imam Ghazali, another great figure, at the age of 40, he transformed, not from Mu'tazili to Ash'ari, but this time from a well-established, rich, powerful professor, Ghazali. He became a humble dervish Sufi. And then he went to the mausoleum of the Prophet Abraham and took an oath that he will never be paid by political authorities again. He will never teach their madrasas again. He will never even join political authorities, debate majlis gatherings again. So even Ghazali, who is one of the architects of ulama state alliance, knew that there should be a separation, and he regret that he became part of power politics. So that's fascinating. That, as I said, even the most radical accept that there should be some interpretation.
So can we then say that Ghazali was an Asharite who basically believed that Quran's word has to be literally understood? So Asharite's basic idea is, emphasis is that every word of Quran means just what it means, and the Mu'tazila thought that they can interpret it. Is this the difference?
There are a list of differences. This is one of them. But even this one is very nuanced, because if you ask an Ashara, they say on some specific issues, yes, that we need interpretation. Because the Quran itself says certain verses in the book are muhkam, which is literal taking. Some are mutashabih. Mutashabih means open to interpretation. So if the Quran says itself, how can you deny, right? Another debate is the free will. Mu'tazili believe in the free will. Human beings create the free will. Whereas Ash'ari says God creates, humans don't have the true free will. And this is a theodicy problem, because let's say a small child was murdered. You say it is evil. How come Allah give permission to this evil? Mu'tazila has a simple answer. The murderer is responsible, not Allah, because it's not God created. The murderer created the act. Ash'ari says, no, everything created by God. Then how do you explain the evil happen? They say it's not evil. It seems evil, but in the broad picture, it's not evil. So this is so.
Are you then
another debate?
Are you then saying that Ash'arites would say that a murderer cannot be held responsible for the murder because the murder itself?
No, of course. No. Of course, murderer will take. But it is a theoretical debate who created what on the ontological sphere. But of course, the murderer is responsible for Ash'arite.
It's interesting that you just referred to Muhakkam and Mutashabbi. You know, I was actually reading it myself, because many people appear on my YouTube from time to time. And when we talk of, I talk of, cooperating with the American Congress, or, developing relationship and leverage in the West. They say, well, in Quran, it is said that the Christians and the Jews can never be your friends. And I was explaining to them in one of my previous vlogs that this is not a Muhakkam, this is a Mutashabbi. Can you explain a little bit? I mean, this kind of statement.
This is fascinating. This is a very important point. And, there is a late Ottoman scholar called Said Nursi. And when he was asked, because the Ottomans had this debate very deep, because the political project was to move from the separation between Muslim, non-Muslim citizenship and Ottoman identity state tried to create, Muslims, non-Muslims together. Then there was a big debate. What about the Quranic verses, as you just referred? Then this Ottoman scholar says, is it permissible for a man to get married with a Christian woman? And they say, yes, men can get married with Christian and Jewish women. So you get married and you don't love your wife? How come you don't love your wife if you are getting married, right?
So, but on the other hand, many Muslim women also raise the question that if Muslim men can get married to pretty Christian and Jewish women, why can't Muslim women also get married with Jewish and Christian men? I mean, what is the response?
This question, then the interest question, whether interest is forbidden is not. Yeah, I generally try to skip these questions, because we have to look at the major political structure. If this ulama state alliance is dismantled if we have an open society where we can debate these issues, then we reach the goal. Then people decide, then there will be free market of ideas, and then Muslims with their good sense and logic will make the decision. That's the important. I'm not in a position to say who is right, who is wrong. And let me tell you an anecdote. A major scholar of historian emailed me after I published the book saying that, Ahmet, there's a major problem in the book. And I said, how can I fix it? What is the problem? He said, you don't tell the readers what the true Islam is. I said, oh, I'm very happy. This is the whole point in the book. Of course, I am a Muslim. I even went to Hajj, Alhamdulillah. So I have my own understanding of Islam, but I didn't put it in the book. The book is about historical analysis, and the only message I say, we should respect diverse opinions. Even a very radical set of ideas from Islamic point of view is welcome as long as they don't become hegemonic. The problem is domination and hegemony.
So I remember in your book you also discussed that the growing schism between Sunnism and the Shiaism also led to military mullah or straight mullah alliances in two different spheres of the Muslim civilization. Is that right?
You mean sectarianism? The question.
As a result, that the Sunnis increasingly got the Abbasids, and then subsequently,
definitely
got insecure about the rise of the Shiaism across North Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, Fatimids.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is a point that I missed during the debate on 11th century. You're absolutely right. In addition to the economic crisis and the rise of semi-feudal Iqta system, there were other things. One, as you referred to, was the rise of Shia powers in the 10th, 11th centuries. At that time, there was the concept of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, but there was no clearly defined Sunni. There was multiple mazhabs, schools of Kalam and Fiqh, theology and law. And Hanafis, Hanbalis, Shafi, Maliki, Ashari, they were competitors, sometimes enemies of each other's. They're very divided. People were not saying I am Sunni. They were saying I am Hanafi, you are Hanbali, the other Ashari, although Ashari is Kalam school. But for various reasons, as you said, Fatimids in North Africa, Karmatis in Arabian Peninsula, Hamdanis in Syria, Buwayhis in Iraq, all of them Shia powers. They established very strong powerhood and a caliphate, Fatimids in Egypt. Then they control Baghdad and make Abbasi Caliph as symbolic, like Pope today in Vatican. Then
they ended up controlling the Abbasid Caliphate at one point.
Yeah, the Shia Buwayhis militarily, politically control entire Baghdad and Iraq. And they say Abbasi Caliph is just symbol. And then a very powerful father and son to Abbasi Caliph, Qadir and Qaim, declare a creed, an aqidah. It's called Aqidah al-Qadiri, or the Qadir's creed. They declare Shia, especially Ismailis, as enemy. They declare Mu'tazila infidel, rationalists, and the philosophers too. And then they declare non-practicing Muslims infidel, and call all the mazhabs, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, to establish a unified Sunni ground, a Sunni bloc. Ghaznavi Mahmud the Ghaznavi, embraced, but he couldn't come to Baghdad. But Turks, the Seljuk, came to Baghdad, defeated the Shia, make the Abbasi Caliph strong again. And that's how ulama state alliance economically, religiously, politically emerge. And first the Seljuks in Central Asia and Iraq. Then after Saladin, they defeated Fatimids in Egypt, Tunisia, and then the Sunni ulama state alliance spread there. And then when the Ottomans and Safavi were enemies of each other, Ottomans, sectarian, Sunni, Safavis embraced Shia. So when I sent this project to a Turkish friend in America, a political scientist, he said, Ahmet, you are proving that we, the Turks, destroyed the Muslim golden age, the Seljuks. I said, no, my friend, it's a joint effort of Seljuk Turks, Abbasi Caliphs, which are Arab, and then all the bureaucrats were Persian. Nizam al-Mulk, the great Ghazali was also Persian. So don't blame Turks only. That's a joke.
It's very interesting. I mean, when I read your book and many other books, I'm reading another book, A History of the Muslim People, Muslim World. So the rise of the Ottoman Empire from the 13th and 14th centuries, when it starts, is actually taking place at a time when the Muslim intellectual mind was already declining. So the Ottoman military power was rising. They go ahead and they, in the middle of the 15th century, they end up conquering Constantinople, which actually looks like such a climax. But intellectually, they were declining, and intellectually, the Western Europe had started to develop its ascendancy. Am I right?
You are right. That's a very important point, and it disrupts and then makes some Turkish friends uncomfortable because we all grow up with the idea of Ottoman Golden Age, and my analysis is that they were part of intellectual decline. So here is the thing. Of course, we are talking about 600 centuries. Some Ottoman rulers, like the Fatih, the conqueror of Constantinople, they were very open-minded. The Sultan Mehmet Fatih, he opened an observatory in Istanbul, and he tried to encourage natural sciences. Another was the famous Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmet Pasha. He established an observatory in 1570 in Istanbul. But unfortunately, when this patron of science, great Pasha, died, the Sultan, the ulama, and the army decided against science for various reasons and destroyed the observatory. And from that time to the modernization of the 18th century, so 19th century, there was no scientific production in the Ottoman Empire in terms of cosmology, in terms of certain link to observatory, and they didn't even write a book on America. So the first book, Ottomans, and the last classical book Ottomans wrote about America was 1570, 70 years after Columbus. Until 1830, for about 180 years, they never wrote a book on America. I explain it only by the lack of curiosity, and it shows how intellectual apathy, the lack of dynamism.
So, how significant were the Crusades, and how significant was the Mongol invasion and destruction of Baghdad, the Abbasids at the hand of the Mongols, in terms of the decline of the Muslim intellectual power?
So I made one of the first talks on the book in Oslo, and then there was a Turkish ambassador asked me this question, saying that, why did you underestimate the importance of Western domination from the Crusaders to modern imperialism? Then I thank for the question and say, look, I have a whole chapter on Mongols and Crusaders. And today, some Muslims exaggerate this because they all think it's about foreigners. Foreign invasions. Yeah. We don't have an internal problem. We have a perfect culture, perfect system at home. Only the enemy is coming from outside. This is wrong. No, if you are strong internally, the enemies cannot defeat you. Yes, Mongols and Crusaders were very detrimental. They killed millions of people. Worse, they make Muslims inward looking. When Muslims saw the invasions, they no longer sought for science, art. They look at survival. That's why they went after military heroes. That's a very bad thing. But one point I also emphasize is that the Mongols and Crusaders were military occupation. They came from inferior culture. That's why Mongols easily convert to Islam.
Very, very interesting point.
And the Crusaders learned many things from Muslims. But when the 19th century Europeans came, they didn't come from inferior. They came with better schools, better techniques, better pedagogy, And that time Muslims were in shock.
Very interesting, Professor Kuru. I had always wondered from my childhood that the Mongol military power destroyed the Muslim military power, but very quickly, the same powerful Mongol horsemen accepted Islam. So Islam was far more powerful culturally in terms of civilization, just like they talk in terms of the Han culture in China, that everybody ultimately, the periphery, even if it conquers the center, it submits to the Han culture. So the powerful Mongols converted to Islam. How interesting is that?
Yes, yes, I totally agree with you. So therefore, keep high culture, even if you are military weak. Eventually, you will win.
So this actually brings to the colonialism, right? I mean, we're going forward and backward. So my thesis is this, that of the 49 Muslim countries, apart from Turkey, everybody was virtually colonized. Yes, the British and the Russians were not interested in colonizing Afghanistan, and Iran fell under them for 20 plus years. But Turkey is the only country that wasn't really colonized, right? So what is your thesis that how Turkey escaped colonization?
So a major reason is
your own country, you must have.
yes, the country I love very much. A major reason was the 18th, 19th century reforms.
Right.
Ottoman state rulers realized the problems. They convinced the ulama, first of all, to get the printing press. Ulama said, no religious book will be printed. Then 50 years later, they say, okay, tafsir hadith, but no Quran printed. Then they say 50 years later, the Quran in Arabic, but no translation. So, but the state, after 1839, the Sultan and the bureaucrat says, we should sideline the ulama, embrace certain European laws, commercial laws, some criminal laws in the European style. They open schools. They train the military in a new way. Both the Janissaries, the old school, and the ulama resisted, but for vain. Eventually, the reform make Ottomans military powerful and society powerful, because when the French and British forces occupy Istanbul in 1920, it was the second time the center of caliphate was occupied by a non-Muslim force. It was like the Mongols in Baghdad.
When was the first time?
Mongols occupying Baghdad.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, the first time. The second time, 1920, British and French in Istanbul. But they could only stay in Istanbul 2 years. Atatürk was a great leader, but maybe more important than the leader was society, elite, national resistance. Because of thanks to Ottoman modernization, Turks were ready to mobilize. It was not a docile, passive society. It was a dynamic society. There was a parliament. So Atatürk was the leader of a parliament, and the parliament made the decisions during the liberation war. It wasn't simply a military strategy. It was a political system. And then Turks defeated Greek, Italian, French, Britain, and then they left Istanbul. That's one thing. But at the same time, of course, there was the great game between Russia in the north, Britain in the south, Indian continent, and Afghanistan and Iran took advantage of the division between Russia and India, and so did Turkey. Play the balance of power between British and French. If Russia tried to occupy Istanbul, British and French resist. When British and French occupy Istanbul, Atatürk gets support from Soviet Union. So that's also strategically, and Ottomans were great strategists. I criticize them for science and philosophy, but I always appreciate their military strategy. And one last point is that they were like the Habsburg in Europe. So Habsburg in Europe was Catholic clergy state alliance, and Ottomans always support Protestants. In Netherlands, in England, gave them capitulations, economic privileges to divide Europe. And Ottomans succeed to divide Europe, but at the same time, Ottomans unintentionally help Europe, because a Catholic Europe destroying Reformation, Habsburg clergy state would be a very backward, scientifically declining Europe. When the Protestants in Netherlands, in England, in northern Germany defeated the Catholics, Europe became diverse and progress. This is the rise of Europe. So Ottomans helped the rise of Europe.
If I choose my words correctly, Muslim societies, apart from Turkey, when they got colonized, had already intellectually, culturally collapsed. They were not part of the modern industrial culture. They had actually become weak. In a country like Pakistan, it is seen as a military defeat. But I think before the military defeat, they had collapsed scientifically, technically, culturally, educationally, which facilitated the military conquest by the European imperialist. Am I right?
I totally agree, because I see military power a result of socioeconomic development. I went to Florence, Galileo's house, which is a museum now. Interestingly, at the beginning of the museum, you have the Arab astrolabes and Arab tools of the Muslim Golden Age Galileo used. Then Galileo's scientific tools like telescope. Then you have the calculation of an efficient artillery shoot. So Galileo helped European military technology have a better artillery. So if you are scientifically, economically underdeveloped, your military power eventually declines. And then you get colonized.
So when I see the documentaries and I read the books about the fall of the Constantinople or the conquest of the Constantinople, the Ottoman artillery was very important, because by the time in the 1450s, if I correctly remember that, without that powerful Ottoman guns, the cannon, they could not have really destroyed the Constantinople defense perimeter.
Definitely. And it helped Europeans to have a centralized state. They learned from the Ottomans, but eventually they surpassed. So that's what we need today, the Muslim societies, with the self-critics, with the intellectuals like yourself, with this debate we are doing now. Hopefully, Muslim society will appreciate their scientists, their philosophers, their critical thinkers, and eventually they'll be more powerful and wealthier.
So I know that you have a class, you have a university class, but very quickly, a few more minutes. And as I said, that I see this as beginning of a series of discussions with you on your books and on your writings. So of course we cannot really cover every subject. You mentioned 4 Muslim jurists, schools of thought: Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Maliki, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmed Hanbal. And they are continuously referred. Every Pakistani television channel has a religious program once in a day. And the Muslim scholars and ulama or Maulvis that appear, they keep on referring to these 4 Muslim imams. My question is, why these all imams are between the time period of 9th and 10th century and not in 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century? Why didn't we have any other schools of jurisprudence?
That's a $1 million question. So you can ask your question in 2 ways. First of all, what about the schools before them? Yes, there were multiple schools before them. Some say there were hundreds of fiqh and kalam schools. And most of them were eliminated naturally. And these great schools persist because of people's support. But why not after them? This has certain things to do with the state authority. Because once the ulama state alliance established, the Sunni state said these are the 4 mazhabs we legitimize. I went to Egypt, for example. One of the main monuments is Hassan Mosque, where you have 4 corners. They say 1 corner for each mazhab. But this is the state authority designed the architecture and say these 4 are legitimate. So it is a combination, therefore, of people's preference. Yes, these are popular by people, but later on the state eliminate any possibility of the emergence of the new schools. That's what ulama state alliance. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Another point. So coming back to Turkey, I mean, which of course is your country, but has a great. I've been to Turkey many times. I've been
great.
7, 8 times I've been to Turkey, and every time I go to different cities. Let's take the example of the Mughals in India that quickly fall under the British domination, and look at Turkey that resists. My argument will be, which I would like you to consider, is the Turkey from very beginning, from the 15th century, was continuously fighting against the Europe. Initially, the Turks were ascendant, the Ottomans were ascendant. Then the Europeans became more industrialized, more scientific, more technological, and the Turkey and the Ottomans had continuous reversals from 16th and 17th century. But the Ottoman power was continuously engaged with the ascendant European power. Unlike the Mughals, that were simply, they were totally disconnected. They were living in isolation. All the ideas that used to come to the Mughal India were coming from Central Asia. That pipeline of the ideas started to dry with the rise of the industrialization. And then the British naval power suddenly fell over the Mughals, and they had no idea how to resist that. Am I right?
Oh, this is also a very complex question. So, both Ottomans and Mughals in India were military powers. And, originally they came from a Timuri, Turkic, Central Asian Sultanate. And as far as I understand, Mughals in India were much more army-based. Ottomans, since being in Mediterranean, achieved to be both army and navy power.
Yes.
And then Ottomans initially were as good as Europeans in navy. But for various technological problems and also the difficulty to have timbers in the African, Asian part, their navy had a hard time to defeat Portuguese because, very briefly, Ottoman grand strategy. They tried to help Muslims in Central Asia by sending the navy from Black Sea to the rivers all the way to Central Asia. They tried to help Muslims in Andalus and Morocco, sending the navy to Western Mediterranean. They also sent the navy all the way from Red Sea to Indian Ocean, India and part of Aceh, Indonesia today. And they tried their best militarily and using the navy. But after the 1600s, they didn't have enough technology and then the timber to build a big navy. Europeans used nautical compass and technology is better. But Mughals, in comparison to Ottomans, pay more attention to merchants, as far as I understand. Therefore, they were producing more. And there is a Turkish Ottoman saying. It says, if you want philosophy and books, go to Europe, which is a shame, by the way. Why are you going to Europe, right? If you want economic products and goods, go to India. They refer to Mughal India. And if you want grandeur and honor, come to Ottomans. So that's what we have. Honorable military, but neither philosophy nor economic production at that level.
So there's an interesting thing, one Western scholar, the late Bernard Lewis, with whom you must be very familiar, who had his major work on Turkey. I was reading one of his books and he basically said that because the Muslim scholars keep on talking that Turks were the Ottomans towards the end of 18th, 19th century were less pious, less modest. So he explained that, one of the fundamental reasons for the decline of the Ottoman power was the discovery of Americas by the Spanish and by subsequently other Europeans. And they were able to bypass the land route of the Mediterranean, of the landmass around the Mediterranean. And they were able to bring the gold, silver, and wealth from the Americas. And they started to become independent of the Ottoman military domination. And thus the Ottomans were not able to collect as much revenue from the trade as the Europeans started to get rich. And this new riches of the Europeans also contributed to the military and industrial power. And how do you look at that?
This is factually correct, yes, and it also explained the decline of Venice and Genoa, because Venice especially was an Italian city-state making intercontinental trade in collaboration with the Ottomans. When the Portuguese and Spain, later on British and Dutch sailants and merchants used the Atlantic ports, Mediterranean ports lost their importance, and we see the economic decline of both Ottomans and Venice and Italy in general. But I want to say that when Europeans make new innovations, geographical discoveries, what were Muslims doing? The first Ottoman ship went to Americas was around 1840. So 340 years, no Ottoman boat sailed to Americas. That showed the lack of curiosity, maybe capacity. I understand that they were busy with other things, but why didn't you send a ship to Americas for over 300 years?
But you're talking of this lack of curiosity in the Ottomans. I mean, just look at the Mughal India. They were never curious about Europe at all. They never had any connection with Europe, with anywhere. They didn't probably, I think the Mughals in India never knew about America. I think they didn't have any connection with the Europeans when they were subjugated by them. But you know, you're also familiar with another great Western scholar, Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, and his seminal paper in Foreign Affairs in June of 1993. And in the very paper and in subsequent book, he dilates about the lack of a model leadership state in the Muslim world. You're familiar with that, right? And he
Yes.
identifies 5 potential leadership states. He starts with Saudi Arabia, he brings in Pakistan, he brings in Iran, he brings in Indonesia, and then he brings in Turkey. And one by one, he said Saudi Arabia is far too conservative, has no real, intellectual class. Iran is Shia. Indonesia is outside the arc of Islam. Pakistan is far more divided and poor. And he says Turkey is the natural leader. Now, this was in 1993. And subsequently, I think that the AK Party and Erdogan, they have actually imagined themselves to be the genuine leader of the Muslim world. How is this project going?
So let's make this important question the last of this particular conversation. But I would say that my advisor Joel Mikdar was a student of Huntington. Whenever I criticize Huntington, Joel Mikdar was always saying me, Ahmet, be nice to him. So he's the advisor of my advisor, and I know the arguments well. I still expect Turkey to be a major leading power. Not now, maybe in the future, after Erdogan, eventually Turkey have a different leader. Maybe after certain extremes of assertive secularism, assertive Islamism, Turkey will find the middle way, Sırat-ı Müstakim, the golden mean. This is still a possibility. But unfortunately, what I see in my beloved Turkey is the lack of sufficient theory. We are a people of practice. Maybe because of the military background. Turks always think that they will find a way in practice. But no, you have to sit down and think theoretically, conceptually. Now, for example, politics in Turkey is very much polarized. People blame each other. They focus on individuals. But what about events? What about ideas? So it's time Turkey really have a theoretical debate, what went wrong, how we can have a better future. And the same for all countries, including United States. We really need serious debate about our theories.
So I know that you have a class. I mean, just summing it up, that coming to your book, we have hardly discussed actually the structure of the authoritarianism, but we have discussed the decline of the Muslim mind, the intellectual ideas. I think the next discussion, we should start from a comparative analysis of the contemporary Muslim world, the major Muslim countries like Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Indonesia, and which country can actually lead the Muslim world, and how can the Muslims come out of the mental, intellectual, scientific stagnation, right? So I think this can be the starting point for the next discussion.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that. Pakistan is very important for me. In fact, recently I have to show that the Urdu translation came out, and I said that when I was a child in Turkish TVs, they all say Jive, Jive Pakistan, because it was one of the few countries that Turks really trust in, and therefore my friendship with you and then the audience in Pakistan and Pakistanis in other countries is very important for me to have some connection with them.
Thank you, Professor Kuru. And the feeling in Pakistan is the same for the Turkish people. I think Turkey is, in fact, the most popular nation, most loved nation in Pakistan. But Professor Kuru, thank you so much for this majestic discussion. And I look forward to staying in touch and treat it as a series of discussions. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.